back to our third day for our third week of our online Canvas class. And yesterday we looked at kind of this bridge lesson between both Saul and David, how they're both kind of, Saul's falling as David's rising into his power, or we could say, that he's becoming the king as Saul's rule is fading. We mentioned this yesterday, right? Like that at the very end, when Saul's eventually at his deathbed, David does become king. And one of the things that you're going to see today is how where Saul's focus was a lot on himself, right? Saul's focus is on his will, his rule, his ideas. David's going to have a much better relationship with God. And that's going to be a source of a lot of blessings, but it's also going to end up being kind of a source of like a teaching moment for David in other ways too. Now, we're actually going to break this up into two parts. So today we're just going to look at David's sort of rise and the strength of Jerusalem under David's rule. And then we're going to look at David's kind of dark moments and downfall a little bit more in Thursday's lesson, okay? Now, David, just to give you a preview, is not going to fall the same way that Saul did. David is going to make a few mistakes down the road, but the big thing with David, and this will be an echo throughout the Davidic story, is that David remains faithful even after he's made mistakes. And so he's sort of given us a good emblem or an image of what our relationship to God should be like. God is always faithful, right? We already knew that. But think of Saul. Saul does not stay faithful to God and ultimately falls, right? The Israelites up until this point have had this pattern and repetition of sin and needing saving, but it never seems to last. David at least is going to get pretty close, right? Like he's going to make a mistake, but he's going to turn back to God and ask for God's mercy. And the effects of that mistake don't necessarily go away. But because David desires to seek God's forgiveness, God's going to show him a great blessing. Obviously, the idea being that his throne will last forever. And we'll end today with that sort of that note. Okay, so let's get into it today. The first big thing to note about David's rule is that he establishes Jerusalem as what you kind of know it as today. Now, this is what Jerusalem would have looked like in David's time. It's kind of hard to make out the scale in this picture here. These are gigantic trees, not tiny little bushes. But the old city of Jerusalem still exists today. So if you were to go to Jerusalem today, you'd see a ton of modern buildings, which we probably don't think about Jerusalem. But the old city still exists, basically just like this. And what David does is that he makes Jerusalem both the political and the religious center of the entire nation, right? So you could kind of think of how in New Orleans, the religious center, it would be St. Louis Cathedral, but the political center is City Hall on Poydras Street. Or you might even think of, nationally speaking, like what would you think of as our national church? I mean, there is the National Shrine of the Basilica of Immaculate Conception that's just outside of Washington, D.C., but I don't think people really conceive of that as like that's the place where Catholics in America go to worship. What David does is that he combines the two to kind of show in this way that Israel's identity as a nation cannot be separated from its identity as God's chosen people, right? Whereas Saul wants it, his reign was like about Israel becoming just like the other nations, right? Just worrying about the political, the wars, military conquest, things like that. David is going to have this faithfulness to God that's going to say, no, this is incredibly important. And so what he does is, I think the religious side of things is incredibly important. How does he show that? Well, he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And if you remember, the Ark of the Covenant is said to be the place where God's holy presence dwells on earth. So it's got the 10 Commandments in it, right? God is present in it. And so by moving that into Jerusalem, he's basically saying, look, we've been wandering around the desert. We've carried this ark with us through the River Jordan into the Promised Land. Now it's going to have a final resting home in Jerusalem. This is the place where God is. This is the place where Israel as a nation is. This is our one central hub. This is the core of identity is both of these things, right? Both the political identity and religious identity are shared in Jerusalem. And this is, you can kind of think, again, it gives the Israelites a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of identity. That, okay, I get it. We are not like those other nations. you could kind of think about how, for the Saints, we don't like to think of the Saints as just one of many NFL teams. We like to think of the Saints as uniquely New Orleans, and that it's unrepeatable, right? Like, what did the Bengals have to do with Cincinnati, or what is outside of the fact that there are Dolphins in Florida? There's just a mascot relationship there, but there's something so integral to the city with the Saints. Whether it's post Katrina, you could think of the rebirth of the city and the rebirth of the Saints. There's something intricately related. Or you could think of with Jesuit, right? Like, there's a lot of really great schools out there in the world. There's a lot of great schools that are academically successful, that get people into good colleges. But the combination of both academic excellence, athletic excellence, and then that religious core spiritual component to what makes Jesuit is caught up, or really is the foundation of our identity, right? That we're not just a finishing school for the upper middle class, that we really educate the mind, body, and soul of all of our students. That's the core of our identity. David's saying the same thing for the Israelites, is that the core of our identity is not just politics, it's not just military, it is religious. In fact, that's the foundation of it. So, David then says, since we're going to put it in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's going to be a permanent city, let's build a big old temple for God. Now, this is a good and holy desire, right? He's not trying to say, I want to build a temple for me and how awesome I will be. He's like, I want to build a temple for God so that we know like how great God is, and God can rest here in our home. Nathan, a prophet at the time, who's going to come in and out of David's story here, Nathan has a vision. Poor Nathan gets portrayed here as being a bald guy with a big forehead, but Nathan has a vision that says, David, look, you're not going to build the temple. Your son, your heir, will build the temple. So just hold off, hold back, and know that it will be done, but in God's time. Now, this is a big moment, right, for David, because he could say, I don't care what you say, Nathan. I want to build it. I want to do it on my time. But instead, David respects Nathan the prophet, the word that God has spoken, and he does not, in fact, build this temple. And so this is one of those first examples where you see David is very different than Saul. When Saul said, I'm going to do things my way and in my time, David allows God to do it in his way and in his time. Okay? And we're going to see Nathan come back again, though, unfortunately, when David makes his big mistakes. Okay, so last note for today then. So what does God do then for David? God says, David, you have been faithful to me, and thus I will be faithful to you. And so we didn't see this with Saul, but we see it with David. God renews the covenant once again. And he says, this time, this is the final one. This is the last covenant. It is through your line that a kingdom will reign forever. Now, a lot of people at the time thought, oh, okay, that means that David's kingdom will never end, like that his heirs will always lead over Israel, and that the Israelite nation will never fail. And of course, we know that it does, right? We know that the temple that is going to be built does not stand. We know that the country itself does not stand. So what is he implying? Well, for our understanding, it's pretty easy. What he's saying is that it's going to be ultimately fulfilled. The promise from all the way back to Abraham, now to David, it's going to be fulfilled in Christ, who is going to be a legitimate heir of the line of David, and that kingdom, God's holy kingdom, will reign forever and ever. And so you've got these two things going on here, and this is a good way to look at the David story, is you've got kind of what's happening in terms of, like, David does have a huge kingdom. Israel is never stronger politically and military than under David's reign. Like, he's awesome as a political military king. At the same time, right, there's this other line going on there that, no, it's through David's line, yes, that the kingdom will live forever, but it's going to live forever, or reign forever, in the king that is Christ. Not necessarily the way we would conceive of it, but the way God is planning. And that's a great way to think of the David story, is that in David you see the benefits once again, same thing with Joshua, same thing with Moses, that when you follow God's way of looking at things, things turn out for the best. Maybe not the way you would expect it, but the way that God intends it is going to ultimately bring about this saving kingdom forever. Okay? So tomorrow we will talk about David and Bathsheba, and you probably know that story already. But for now, let's end with David being awesome, his kingdom being great, and this promise that the covenant will be fulfilled through David's line. Okay, so same pattern. I know that it's getting tough. It's hard to keep up this pattern, but stay with it. You guys are doing great. I've been really happy with the grades so far, and just give you some words of encouragement there. If you ever want to ask any other questions outside of class, don't forget about the live chat. It ends up saving, so we don't need a discussion board. And then maybe one day or every now and then we'll do a live class. We can just kind of talk and ask questions then too. All right, guys, I will see you in the next one.